Hello, and welcome to this panel discussion brought to you by Someone's Daughter and the View Magazine, recorded during Photo London in September 2021. The Someone's Daughter exhibition has just launched at Photo London, an amazing art and activism project which combines portraits of women who have been brought through the criminal justice system with women who are interested in it. Women activists, artists, leaders, all people who want to raise awareness on issues surrounding the criminal justice system and fighting for reform. Portrait subjects have been matched with an incredible array of international artists and photographers, and we have been looking at how exactly the photographer and the subject communicate with each other and combine to create a magical image. So welcome to our first Rebel Justice podcast episodes, where we're talking about whether art can change the world, creativity, equality, and justice. The panelists are Clare Barstow, artist, writer, and survivor. We have Jen Reid, activist and Black Lives Matter campaigner. You name it, she is in it, the center of it, fighting for a better world. We have Sue Ecclestone, art historian and curator, and we have Andy West, author and teacher of philosophy in prison, with a huge amount of experience within the system itself, inside and outside the gates. Welcome, everyone. Clare Barstow, I want to bring you in first of all. How important is it to combine activism with art? Does it bring people to issues that they usually would avoid?
Yes, absolutely. I found that I was able, through my art, through my writing, through my painting, through my plays, and also by giving other women a forum through I set up a lot of different prison magazines. I was able to raise topics and issues that really mattered and that really could make a difference, and that did sometimes change things and how people thought and how people perceive things, and it really gave women a voice, and that was, to me, was key in trying to bring about change, because with activism and art together you can really engage people, and maybe people that aren't always that active in other ways, but they can see it through your eyes and they can learn a lot, and they can really sometimes change their opinion and viewpoint or engage with something that they wouldn't necessarily have done so. So for me, it's been absolutely vital as a way of trying to reform, or work towards the reform of the criminal justice system and other issues that could be related to that as well.
Andy West, let me bring you in here. It seems to me that Clare Barstow is really talking about empathy and fostering an understanding of how other people go through the world and experience it. What do you say to this?
That's such a great question. I can think to one class I ran in particular in terms of what it says about empathy and what art can offer in that regard. So I was in a men's prison on this occasion. There's a famous picture by Caravaggio called David with the Head of Goliath. And it's a painting that Caravaggio painted while he was actually wanted in Rome for murder. And he was on the run, and he painted this image of David holding Goliath's head, the boy having slain the giants and decapitating him and holding his head. And it's an interesting image for all sorts of reasons. One is that it's a self-portrait of Caravaggio. He's painted himself, both as David and Goliath. He's painted himself as cutting off his own head. And the second reason it's so interesting, especially for today's panel, is he then sent that painting to Rome as a plea for clemency, as an attempt to get a pardon. So it's really the meeting of justice and art right there in that painting. And I told the men in my class about this story, and I said, well, imagine that you were in Rome and you were the Minister for Justice and you just received this painting. What would you say? Would you give him his pardon or not? And I had a very talented artist in the class, a wonderful draftsman, wonderful at portraits, still lives, had drawn some amazing things, even through sort of 23-hour bang up in his cell, just had this amazing eye. And he said, no, I wouldn't give Caravaggio his pardon. And some of the other people were perplexed about this. And they said, why not? You draw all the time, you paint, why not? And he said, well, the reason I do that is to be someone else. And I thought that was really powerful in terms of illustrating what art can give someone who is in prison. I think one of the effects of having a criminal conviction can be that you live with a very singular story from here on in, that it's very kind of claustrophobic to your identity, and you don't get to be anybody else other than this person who committed this crime, this person in prison. And the art for this individual allowed to put out a much richer version of who they are to the world, and a much truer version in some ways.
What has been your experience of working within the system? What are you hearing from the people that you work with directly? What do they need? Jen Reid, let me ask you, off the back of that issue of single stories and having your identity broken down into just one narrative and just one label, how do you feel about increasing number of people calling themselves activists, and how do you feel about that label? Because it seems as if you can't be an influencer, a 20-year-old influencer, without also being an activist about something. Is the label reductive?
For me, it's not a tick boxing exercise. You have to make a change. You have to kind of step up to the plate. Like I said yesterday, for me, it's actually the penny dropping and realizing that I am an activist, and I always have been. It's now in the open and everyone knows, but it took me a while to kind of catch up, with myself. And, from art, creating change, I think my husband taking that picture of me on the plinth, that has, went worldwide. And I think art is just a very peaceful but very powerful way for people to be involved. And, it sparks conversation, it's motivational, it's inspirational, and it's just another great form of communication. And that there's no language barrier there.
Stu, you're an art historian and curator, and you're also the founder of a painting prize. I'm assuming that you would not have founded that prize unless you truly believed that art could change the world. Or could you change the status quo in some way? Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's a form of activism, I suppose. Yeah, the prize was formed actually because I was curating an exhibition in London, and a gentleman came in one afternoon. He looked at the paintings and he said, "Oh, there are no paintings in here by women." And he said, "Why is that?" And before I could answer him, he simply went, "Well, of course, there are not many women artists." And it occurred to me that I was perpetuating a real unevenness, a real gender disquality, if you like, in the art world. 29% is about the average when you look at exhibitions across the world. So when you look at the places like the National Gallery, big American galleries, big Australian galleries, if you're lucky, 29% will be women artists, but actually more often than not that much. So I was actually quite shocked with myself that I had perhaps not been championing women artists, and I felt this was the time to do something about it. So along with House at Hampstead, where I was at the time, we developed the prize, and we thought, let's just have a prize that's just for women and have exhibitions and make sure that actually we do something about that gender disquality. And, we got men involved. We were not excluding men. Men were involved. They were sponsoring. They are sponsoring. They are helping. So it's not that we're trying to make this a sort of women exclusive zone, but we are actually literally championing women to try to even up. And we've been challenged about it. And, I've been asked, why are you not doing a men's prize? And I said, you could do one. That's been my answer to that.
Have you noticed that this kind of soft activism is just trying to change the world a little bit? Does it have a knock-on positive effect? You encounter resistance in the first year perhaps, but perhaps in the subsequent years, other people are taking your cue and being inspired by you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the very fact that it is a women's only art prize and it does meet some resistance does mean that it opens up a conversation, which is really good. People do start to talk about why is it only a women only competition. So that's good. That sparks debate. But also, I think that, funnily enough, I was just saying to these guys when we came on that this year I particularly noticed that the type of art that we were actually getting through into the competition had changed. I put that down to lockdown, perhaps heightened emotions, people are actually more in touch with themselves. But I also think that because it's a women-only space, that somehow women feel more comfortable putting art into the competition that they might otherwise not put into a competition that was open to the whole public. Say, for example, the Moll Galleries, to name a few, they have lots of competitions. They, it's male, female, all manner of works, but you never see anything very contentious. It's mostly very traditional work. And this year we had work that was dealing with the menopause, trans issues, lockdown, mental health. So I think it also allows for that situation too.
You mentioned the COVID pandemic, and this is something that we absolutely can't avoid discussing. Clare Barstow, you spoke about how important it has been creating, writing, producing your work for your development as a person, but also just publicly as an artist, as an activist or writer. So what's it been like creating during the 18 months? Has it been more difficult to focus on certain issues above others?
Yes, well, I found that obviously the circumstance of the pandemic has informed some of my writing, and obviously it's sometimes difficult as well. Often I'd end up working with a group of people, and a lot of the work I've had to do has been on via Zoom, which can be a challenge, but at the same time, it can also be more inclusive in the sense that anybody from around the country can access it. But I've found there's been a lot of support from people we've all had to come together and try and produce work, whether it's short films, animation, art, writing, whatever, in the most trying of circumstances with very little of the outside stimulus, but at the same time going into an inner journey within ourselves. And sometimes that's produced some of the most creative stuff. And a lot of people have managed to get, found different ways of producing work. And I think we've all found different ways of working and adapting. And I think some of the pieces that have come out of it as a result have been really strong and really powerful. Some of it's focused on some of the losses that people have experienced, but it's also been about encouragement and hope, and the fact there's been so much support amongst fellow artists. It's been quite incredible in that sense. And I suppose people are developing more online stuff that can then now go into work that can be exhibited to a wider audience. I think the access of people setting up different networks has actually maybe allowed for more inclusion, which I think has been a powerful message in itself.
Andy, let me bring you in here. How has the pandemic been for you in terms of your prison work? Are you still inside or on the outside? Are you noticing that there's been a deprecation in the mental health of people that you work with?
So my prison work in particular was very restricted during the pandemic. I think the regimes almost everywhere were so restricted, but especially for something like philosophy, it was especially so. I did have a bit of written correspondence with some people in prison. I got some really, really long responses, much longer than I would normally get with any kind of written stuff. It's also, you just get a sort of, I'm sending in work, someone's sliding it under their cell door, they're writing something, it's getting slid out the cell door and back to me. It's noticeable that my students don't have the same access to things like dictionaries that they would have had. There's a lot more crossings out and things like that. I'm now going back into prison to teach, and yeah, it's like everything, it's just going to take us a lot. Changes just happen so much slower in prison than it does out here, and I feel like that work is going to be very, I was supposed to then teach again the other day. There was an outbreak on a wing, everyone's in lockdown. That whilst we're coming out of lockdown, I still feel like a lot of people in prison are in the thick of it, so that's slowed my work down quite a lot.
This is something I wanted to bring up with you, Jen. Andy's really talking about a situation in which he's been doing this work. It's going really great, and then something happens like a global pandemic, and all the positive changes, the great momentum that's occurred, suddenly starts going backwards. Jen Reid, let me ask you. You were talking about how art can change the world, but are those gains really permanent, or can they backslide and revert as soon as something else steps in that's more important?
Yeah, I think that is the case. And I think that is down to us as individuals to kind of keep that momentum up. You know, we have a few things going on here in Bristol, but we're being very contrived about in the sense of we have something coming up in a few months because we don't want to put everything out there. And it's just keeping that conversation alive, keeping those issues out there, but not to bombard it because, you know, people soon lose the passion that they had for it, which is why I say that this is the long game, you know, that we're in it for. And obviously with the pandemic, it has been difficult. You know, things would be a lot easier, but it's just like trying to control that narrative as in when we do things. So we are very aware of that. But, you know, people do have lovely surprises coming to them soon with what we're doing.
Do you think that right now there's too much compassion fatigue? We're largely staying at home and receiving news about the world online. So you log on to The Guardian and other sources and papers and you read headlines not just about race, sex, class. You learn that the world is basically on fire. And instead of re-engaging, it makes people take a step back. How do you continue the conversation with the people you'd like to be reaching?
There was a mural that has gone up in Bristol, which was painted by Mr. Sen's, an artist, and which is depicting a picture of me on the statue. And that was to commemorate the Black Lives Matter protest. And that is, you know, it's a huge wall and it's there. And that's what I mean about engaging people and just dropping certain things over the next coming months. So that was something that had kind of reignited that, and something that it's such a big wall that cannot be missed, and getting that out into the media. Just to remind people that this is still an issue. This is something that's not going away, you know, and it wasn't just all about last year on the 7th of June. This is an ongoing thing. And it's just really important to keep that going.
Sue Ecclestone. Jen Reid has referenced a mural. Now it strikes me that the visual arts, as in art, film, photography, painting, is an ideal way to combine aesthetics with activism, because you're not requiring that people read their way through a manifesto or something that is persuasive. There is an immediate pleasure to visual art. How do you see yourself at this stage? You're coming from an art history and curating background, but now you're in this other space where you're having to answer questions about why you have this prize, why are you doing this? Don't you just want to say you just enjoy the work, look at it and enjoy it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, that's what we hope people will do when they come and see the work. But yeah, I mean, I think it's like I said, it's very important that they ask the question about why we're doing what we're doing. But I think that actually, I mean, if I can kind of pick up on what Jen was talking about, because I think that when you talk about whether art can change the world and you talk about the visual, of course, murals, I mean, for hundreds of years, people have used murals to try to get points out to people. And I mean, there are just a few very deliberate artistic things just up behind me here. And one of the things that was actually very important in helping to change the abortion law in Ireland was the one of Savita, who people can look up the story, but I mean, basically she was clinically in need of a termination, but was refused a termination in Ireland and subsequently died of sepsis. When they were having the vote, her mural was really important. It went up by the street artist Archers, and people just went to it. It really, they started putting stickers, laying flowers. So I mean, I'm not sure that anybody was really ready for the response that it was going to get, but it went up and that's what happened. And every time you get one of these ground-changing things that somebody does, you never know whether people are just going to walk past it and ignore it, or whether people are suddenly going to really engage with it, and they really engaged with it. And I think the point about visual art in terms of activism, if you like, is that it's democratic. So, like you say, people can look at it and they can decide to see what they want to see, or something completely different, or they can, I mean, people can read it any way they like. It's not telling people how to think. And I think that's a very, very democratic thing.
Andy, I want to bring you in here because I can see you nodding, and it was exactly at the point that Sue was talking about not forcing people to think in any way, but simply inviting them to think, whatever their conclusion is. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, I think art will do that anyway. I think good art will just make you think rather than tell you what to think. So one of the things I was nodding there about is perhaps there's a risk that art could actually sort of perpetuate an inequality as well in some way. And I think that's when art perhaps becomes a sort of corrective, when it's used to sort of rehabilitate people. There was a story in The Guardian about someone who was sentenced to read Jane Austen last week, someone who was found to have a lot of images about sort of white extremist, white supremacist stuff on his computer, and he was sentenced to read art sort of as, instead of punishment, sort of be corrected. So it's interesting that we think art could do that, rather than art could unleash your own imagination to find your own sort of vision and to go forward. I'd also think one really important thing in this conversation is whether it is whose art are we talking about here. There was a programme on the BBC a couple of years ago called The Choir, about Gareth and Lone, I think, going into HMP Aylesbury, young offenders prison, and setting up a choir and teaching people music. It was very positive in lots of ways. I enjoyed it in lots of ways. But a big part of the narrative framing was about types of music and culture with a capital C, and culture which actually already exists within the prison. And how much are we, I think as teachers, we have to be careful about how much we're sort of bulldozing a pre-existing culture. So in that case, the documentary was saying that, there's so much drill music in this prison. This is a real problem. All these kids are listening to drill. And the choir was much more sort of pop, kind of bluesy, a tiny bit of rap involved. But the fact is that there was already a kind of music there, and that there's a kind of music that could appeal to that art is sort of often already existing. And perhaps when we're sort of bringing art into prisons, we have to be careful that we're not actually imposing another sort of, that we're not alienating people from their own sort of art practices anyway.
Claire, when you were talking right at the top about kinds of creativity you've been engaged in throughout your years, but also just in the last 18 months, I was astonished by what the variety was. Different kinds of writing, different kinds of imagining stories. Who is it for? Is it for coming out of yourself? Is it to make a statement about yourself? Is it self-expression? Is it a form of communication? How do you see yourself as an artist?
Yes, obviously, to some extent, it's a form of expression, being able to communicate to people, how I see different situations, how I feel about things, my emotions coming out through my writing and my art and my plays and all the other drama, all the other stuff that I do. But it's also trying to put a voice as well to, well, mainly women in particular, but also people who, marginalised people who haven't got a voice and who don't, or feel they haven't got a voice. And I try and echo that through my work, because I feel that some people are underrepresented and they're not being given the airtime or the opportunities. And I think if you can, by trying to improve the situation by exhibiting work at different exhibitions and curating exhibitions that have included some work from former prisoners, but also and other marginalised people in society, but also trying to find ways I can speak, for them until they are able to speak for themselves, really. So at least some of what they're saying gets heard. And if they're not able at this time, but maybe in the future, to speak out about things, then maybe if people will see my work, they can at least get an idea of what it's like for some of these people in particular. And prison is very much a closed world, and if some of the women there don't get a chance to get their voice out, which, I mean, obviously the View and the Inside Time and also some of the books and stuff that I've been involved with, they're beginning to start getting women's voices out and men's voices out. But, until that happens, at least I can then try and echo, to some extent what they're saying and try and include it in my work, so at least some of their viewpoints are coming across.
Jen Reid, you were at Photo London yesterday on the VIP preview day, so you were finally seeing the Someone's Daughter portraits in real life. How did it feel to see all those images next to each other? along with the text, were you able to glean any sense of the impact those images were having? Did you happen to watch other people as they were moving through that space, reacting to the images?
Yeah, it was just really powerful. And just looking at the images of women and looking in, the lady that was on the panel yesterday, and just looking into her eyes and seeing her as a person, and she told us a lovely story yesterday of now having a voice, that inner strength that she has always had has come out. And yeah, people, they really took it. It was great. And, people bought magazines. Yeah, it was just really, really powerful, really powerful.
Just to take on board Andy's point, not about elitism so much as sort of imposition of one narrative across the top of another narrative. Photo London isn't an art and activism fair. It's a very broad-based global photography showcase. How did a project like Someone's Daughter sit alongside all the other artists and all the other galleries that were showing? Was it in its own sort of ghetto corner for good causes, or did it stand up artistically and philosophically?
I definitely think it did. And I think it is that shock factor, which then intrigues people more, which is great. There are other spaces there that were just as small, had every right to be there. And I hope people who saw it actually went away and had a good think about why that was exhibited there. Yeah, it was great. Really good.
Sue Ecclestone, I really liked Jen's phrase, having the right to be there. Maybe just taking up space and showing one's faces is changing the game, even without saying anything. As we get towards the end of this first Rebel Justice podcast, my question for you, Sue, is, can art change the world? And if so, how? What's something we can all do, even to change it in a small way?
Oh, well, yeah, okay, big way. You can do something to change it in a big way. Access to art. I mean, I'm just taking on board everything that everyone's just said. The word that came out was voice, 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 voice. And I think that it's really interesting that we all know, everyone sitting here knows that we have a voice and that we can use it to express ourselves. Now, whether that voice is through poetry, music, TV, books, art, it doesn't really matter. But there's a whole section of children growing up that actually don't have access to any of this. Funding for the arts in schools now is being very much pulled back. The private system recognises the need for, as Andy put it, culture with a big C, and children that are in the private system or are children part of well-off middle-class families are likely to experience museums, galleries, theatres, even the ballet, certainly pop concerts, all of those spaces. And that recognises for them that they have a voice, that this is actually how people express themselves, and they can express themselves like this. But children from poorer backgrounds, they don't have access to any of this. They very rarely would they be in those spaces, and then they don't realise they have a voice, and then they don't know how to express themselves. So really, I think in a nutshell, we have to pressure successive governments and environments for more money. And you talk about equality, and of course there is no equality if you've got children from poorer backgrounds who don't have access to these things, and they therefore don't recognise how to express themselves, and they don't have a voice. You don't have equality. Children that are exposed to the arts are 3 times more likely to go to university. So I think that probably, you asked me if there's any small thing that we can do. Yeah, I mean, we can, all of us, put some pressure and put that to bear on actually making art available for everybody, children, adults, but everybody.
Thank you so much. Andy West, closing thoughts for you. Can art change the world? And if so, how? And if you want to give anyone a tip on a small change they can do just starting today, starting right now, what would it be?
Can art change the world? Yes, I think it can. I think it lets us know what the world is like, and it lets us know how the world could be different. By enriching our imaginations, we can imagine a better world and then bring it about. And there was a second part to your question.
Which is, what changes would you like to see people making? Not everyone sees themselves as a capital A activist, but we can all do just something to affect the status quo.
With regard to people in prison?
Yes, I think so. Something that's been very interesting when I've been hearing your comments in the conversation is that you're one of the only two people on the panel so far that has the experience of working within prisons, and so that's very valuable.
Right. So I'm going to switch modes slightly to answer that question, if that's okay, because my brother was in prison as I was growing up, and so was my dad, and so was my uncle, in fact. And I think when I went to visit, say, my brother in prison, coming out after that, it was really painful how little people knew about that world. So what I would want people to do is just engage with this. There's a whole universe of humanity behind that wall. And because it's behind that wall, because it's not a transparent institution, because there's so much we don't know about it, we're quite disengaged with it. So I think just engage, and art, either about that world or made by people in that world, is really essential to doing that. Yeah.
During your formative years, did you tell other people that your brother, uncle, and father were in prison, or did you somehow keep the secret?
Well, I think during my formative years, no, I didn't. It was. I didn't really know how to talk about it, but now it feels incredibly imperative, actually. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's part of what we're doing with Someone's Daughter. Not just the exhibition, but also the podcast series that we are releasing, and indeed these conversations. It's also about demystifying that world altogether. One very odd thing is that people are fascinated by it, so once we start talking about it, people do listen. That brings me to Clare Barstow for final words based on everything that we've been talking about. Do you believe, based on your experiences, that art can change the world, and what can we do moving forward?
Yes, absolutely. I think art is a real driving force for change. I think it seems to be that a lot of creative people getting together and producing art in all different forms and on all different levels is the way forward. And I see it when I do go out, I see art in different places that I never experienced, hadn't experienced before. People are becoming more radical in their art, and even the Turner Prizes, the shortlists are all collectives. They're recognising that it's groups of people that can affect change. And I think, things that a lot of people, it's very much more collaborative, and people are producing work together. Because of that, I think that is going to make the difference. I think together, if people can produce, and they can produce works on all levels and in all forms, and use all different types of art to produce even one piece of work. And people are responding to a lot of things that are happening in the world, whether it is the environment, the pandemic, or the inequalities in society and the criminal justice system. And people are where they are responding, they are really slowly bringing about some form of understanding. And by getting people to understand what the situations are, that's the only way forward, because then if people understand, then they're more likely to want change as well. And I think that's how we can take this forward in the next decade, and hopefully grow on the seeds we have now and really produce something spectacular to really affect change in the world.
Thank you so much. Jen has looked for potential for a change, for a moment, for a decade. Because that's how long it really takes to change the world in some of these transformations. Do you believe that art can change the world, and what can we do going forward, Jen?
I definitely think that art can change the world. I think, it's out there, get it in people's faces. And I think as a collective, as a people, as a human race, I think it's about people doing their bit, bringing things to people's attention and forcing that change onto people. And if people don't want to take it on board, it's just there and it's in your face. So I just think, it's just being very forthright with it and continuing to do that for people to be heard.
And what would you like people watching this broadcast and people who saw our exhibition, Someone's Daughter, to carry forward with them if they want to make a small change starting that day?
I think what people can do is to look at people's stories and look at those people as human beings and find out their stories, and then do their bit, in whichever way they can, to make a change, whether that's by, writing to someone in prison or supporting someone. It's just, there's very simple things that you can do to make a difference to somebody's life. And it'd be great if people could carry that away and see how courageous, the easiest thing to do is not always the right thing to do. And these women have overcome so much adversity and look where they are now. I feel very proud of them, really do.
Thank you so much, Jen. And thanks to everyone that closes this part of our panel series, brought to you by Someone's Daughter, the View Magazine's campaign to change the way you see justice. Someone's Daughter exhibition was displayed at Photo London in September 2021. It's about women in the criminal justice system. It includes photos of survivors, activists, leaders, influential women, and it involves an entire roster of world-acclaimed contemporary photographers and artists. Clare Barstow, Andy West, Sue Ecclestone, and Jen Reid, thank you very much for your insights. And thank you, more importantly, for the tips you gave about what we can do to change the world going forward. Thanks and goodbye. Look out for the second Rebel Justice podcast next week and follow us across social media. We're at Rebel Justice.